So we've got this other voice that's speaking always. C.S. Lewis warned, error and sin both have this property, that the deeper they are, the less their victims suspect their existence. So I want to assume for a second that since we're in a church setting, that at least most of us have a basic assumption that Satan is real. Is that safe to assume, right? But the problem comes in is that we think he's going to show up looking evil. We think that. See, we're expecting to see Satan. But instead, we see Santa. That's how he comes at us. We expect one thing, but he appears as something else. 2 Corinthians 11:14 says, for Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. Paul is writing to Christians. He's saying, hey, heads up. This is a sly, scheming father voice. And later, or actually earlier in Corinthians, 2 Corinthians 2:11, he's talking about resolving issues among people, resolving anger. And he's saying, we got to resolve these things, these deep emotional moments, in order that Satan might not outwit us, for we are not unaware of his schemes. So Paul is saying to Christians, Satan has the ability to outwit us, but we don't want to be unaware of his schemes. Unfortunately, many of us are living unaware of his schemes. We live unaware of his voice. And that's why it's so critical that we start to detect his whisper. We start to separate that voice from the other voices. So I'm going to read again from what I wrote about my experience with this second voice. So I wrote, as I reflect on my childhood, from my earliest heartwarming memories of being held in Dad's arms to the searing, cutting daggers of being held against my will in Don's, who was the sexual abuser, the father of this second voice was already well underway in my life. If voice 2 would have been demonstrably evil, there's a chance I would have noticed, even as a young child. I might have been able to escape the alluring whispers telling me that I was on my own, then offered me protection and escape. Perhaps as a young teen, I would have hesitated before jumping headlong into addictive activities to soothe the pain without any assessment of the future cost of my heart and mind. But when the second voice suggests a fix to tranquilize the gnawing ache of my young heart, rarely did I stop and question its motive. I followed, no questions asked, because I thought the offers were there to help. And they did, at first. See, there's a secret ingredient to Satan's successful concoction. The pivotal red pill he must get us to swallow if he's to alter the course of our life. It's his opening line. It's his calling card. Please allow me to introduce myself. I'm a man of wealth and taste. I'm a fan of man. Now, I don't really think that's the truth. I know that Satan is not actually my fan, or anyone's for that matter. I know that the flavor of truth he peddles leads to destruction, pain, and death. But that's not what he whispers. That is not what I embrace deep down, where it matters, when I hear his voice. His voice whispering, I'm not your enemy. I'm here to help you. I'm your fan. I don't choke on the incongruity. I don't reel backwards and run at the thought of Satan handing me a strawberry ice cream cone, promise me a puppy in the front seat of his windowless van if I follow him. Because there, in the hidden parts of my heart, where my deep pain and scars were formed, early moments in my life, are more felt than interpreted, where more thoughts and decisions that I care to admit find their source, and where the first voice laid its foundational grip to interpret my life, the father of lies has already whispered his words, and I've already believed them. I'm your fan. I've got your back. You can trust me. By the point I realize I'm struggling, he's already whispered his poison, and I've already drank it down. Oftentimes, years before, when I was a defenseless child. Like a magician's sleight of hand, Satan distracts us with the caricatures we embrace of him, whether that be him in red horns and a tail or operating as a simpleton. Then he slips in the lie, while I am glassy-eyed and oblivious, while the rest of the grown-ups wait for him to be obvious. But he's never obvious. So we have an enemy, each one of us. Each man, each woman, each child in this universe has an enemy with a capital E. Whether you believe the devil was nothing but a cartoon character, some wearing some crimson costume, or some cosmic killer, Voice 2 has been fathering you well before you even had a clue. His whispers and nudges have been ever present in your story, whether you've noticed it or not, because it's been customized for you. Personal, targeted, purposeful. Pleased to meet you. Hope you guessed my name. What's puzzling you is the nature of my game. See, before we can ever seek to understand how and when the second voice speaks to us, we must first rid ourselves of the notion that identifying such an elusive enemy is an easy task. Even the Bible warns us that he will appear as an angel of light, a phantom man, a man of wealth and taste. He will don whatever mask is needed to get the job done, greeting you with one hand and stealing your wallet with the other. So to start, we have to rid ourselves of this one foundational lie about Voice 2. He is not our fan, and his voice cannot be trusted, ever. Throughout my story of loss and pain and loneliness, even though the circumstances were indeed difficult, an entirely different level of activity was occurring outside of my awareness. Sure, the events themselves were bad, the sexual and emotional abuse, the loss of innocence, disconnection with my dad. Yet deeper still were the messages these moments invited me to embrace as certainty. I soon comprehended Voice 2 employed an interwoven method of techniques, his penchant for twisting language. His favorite tactic is playing translator. And that's what he does. He plays translator. He's an interpreter. He takes words, circumstances, and he gives them an explanation, a reason, an interpretation. In the most simple terms, Voice 2 wants to answer one simple question. Why? Why? When we think about the wound cycle, we talked about this last week, where we have this cycle where situations occur and then there's a message with that. So we have these painful situations, especially when we're young, and there's damage that happens to those, whether the situations were intentional or not. Damage, but hidden in that damage is a message, a lie. And that's where he strikes. He's that source of the lie. When we think about that cycle, that's where he strikes. He brings in a lie. So in my example I gave last week, my dad started working second shift when I was in about first grade. My dad needed to work. But the situation that caused pain was, my dad's not home. My dad's not home. I'm 6 years old, 7 years old. I need my dad. My dad's working. So the situation was, my dad's not home. And that's a painful situation for a kid, whatever the reason. But the lie came in with, well, why am I home alone? Why isn't Dad here? Well, because you're not important to Dad. You're not important. It was a lie. Slipped in so subtly. So subtly. So the lie comes in. And his goal is our agreement with the lie. Because we can hear a lie and not agree with it, or we can say, yeah, I guess I'm not important. Bingo. Boom. That's what Voice 2 is after. It's that agreement that especially those agreements that are targeted at our heart's core questions. Because whatever Dad's answers to those foundational questions are, your identity, your value, your worth, who am I? What am I worth? What am I going to become? It's the enemy gives his version of why to those painful situations. So, situation, Dad's not home, or situation, Mom and Dad are getting a divorce, or situation, Dad left when I was a baby, or I never met my dad. The enemy says, why is that? Let me tell you why that is. Well, because you're not important. Or you're not worth his time. Or you're too skinny. You're too fat. You're too lazy. You're too much like your brother. You're too much like your sister. You're not like your brother enough. Whatever it is. Whatever your situation is, and however your heart specifically is vulnerable, that's what he whispers. That's how he answers. In that movie trailer we played at the beginning, it says at the end, the voiceover says, I believe that the trials we have in this life lead us to our destiny, lead us to our purpose. That's exactly true. Because Satan will strike you in the places and whisper to you in the places that you're meant to live, to display God's splendor, as Gary was talking about this morning. There's a reason you're on this earth right now, in your world right now, because there's something that God has given you. There's something about you and your story that God wants to bring. And if Satan can shut that down, and you never learn your value, you never learn your identity, you'll never find your destiny, what God's called you to do. And so he will whisper in the ways that will short circuit that journey. Does that make sense? It's going to short circuit that for you. And he'll get that short circuiting happening by either having you shrink back. So again, I'll use my story as an example where, for me, thinking I'm not important, I'm just usable. I mentioned a couple weeks ago, I kind of created this interesting combination of because I'm more of an assertive personality. Well, I'm going to go get it then, right? I'm going to go make my worth. I'm going to go prove my worth. When I'm done with you, you're going to go, oh my gosh, that David is just, wow, what a guy, right? And if you don't, I'll work harder. I'm going to keep pushing and keep pushing until you see me and you tell me I have value. And you see me and you go, that guy, who is that guy? Who's David? He's the guy that'll get it done. You're going to give me that identity. Well, if I live that way, I might find a destiny, a calling that I make, but it's not going to be the one God has for me. It might even look similar. I've talked to numbers of men, pastors, leaders, who they're living a version of their calling, but it's all about them because they never understood how to get that core value and that core destiny from a true father. So now they're out trying to prove it by being the best pastor, being the one that has got all the answers. And you see it, unfortunately. You see it when it crumbles. You see when it crumbles. Unfortunately, my wife and I have been involved in a couple of ministries that have crumbled because incredibly gifted individuals, incredibly gifted, some of the most gifted people I've ever met, were trying to get their identity and their value not through their father, through different means. And because it didn't work, they started turning to darker pathways, right? They started turning to things that made them feel like a man in this case. We had an incredible gifted pastor who got caught in a televised police sting for prostitution. He was going to visit prostitutes. This man was probably one of the most gifted musicians, pastors, speakers that I've ever met. But those core questions were never answered. And so he was looking for it. And so it's these places where our hearts are vulnerable. The very place that he was meant to shine is where the enemy whispered and took him out.